Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our Medical and Laboratory business at Intertek. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Zaneer. Hi, Zaneer. How are you today?
Hi, Clarissa. Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So excited to have you today. So I always like to start our conversations just getting a little bit of your background. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your technical expertise, how long you've been at Intertek, and then we will get into our exciting topic for today.
Sure. My name is Zaneer Iqbal, and I've been with Intertek about 10 years now. Originally started off as an engineer, primarily in our hazardous locations group at the time. Since then, been doing a couple different things throughout the years. Got dabbled in a lot of our many industries that we work on. Currently, these days, I manage our West Coast electrical labs, so both in Lake Forest and our Menlo Park offices. But that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day these days.
Yes, and you have a lot of exciting interests in technology and AI and digital health, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So in addition to myself, you were lucky enough to join our team at CES this year. So I think just to kind of start the conversation, maybe we can talk a little bit about, what you saw at CES overall, what your impressions were as you were there, kind of your overall general consensus. I know it can be super overwhelming. I've gone for many years and it's still every single time you're just like, wow, there's so much here, so much to see, and just such amazing advancements in technology. But curious to hear from your perspective, this was your first CES or your first in a long time?
Yeah, it actually was first CES that I've been to, at least physically. So, I mean, from that perspective, obviously, a lot of consumer electronics, a lot of things that, are my fancy. I have a 2-year-old at home. So when I see a robot that can pick up things with an articulating arm, that excites me. But beyond that, I mean, a lot of it was, AI focused, right? Especially in the medical space also. I think a lot of the innovations were revolving around the sort of the real-time continuous monitoring of data. That, not to say that the data didn't exist before, but it was always, oh, here's the data. Doesn't necessarily tell you what it means. But with the advent of AI these days and a lot of that, large language models and the AI agents we see today doing something with those models, it's a lot more, it gives you a lot more insight as to what that data means. And I think that is the direction where a lot of things are going. And it's very exciting.
Yeah, I think, of course, as you mentioned, right, we saw a lot of robotics. I think that's something that was very common and has been at, a lot of shows that we've seen, both related to healthcare specifically and otherwise. We saw a lot of wearable devices. And then this, very big buzzword of AI, in the medical space. I think AI is really interesting because, of course, we've been employing AI in a lot of different ways in medical for a very long time, right? It's not new. They've been clearing AI devices in medical since the 90s. But now you're seeing, right, because of this, I think, convergence, right, of consumer culture and everyone who is, just so excited to look at AI, or you hear, of course, about ChatGPT. Everyone talks about it, right? It's a buzzword. So now you see everyone really talking about and highlighting the AI that's being used in their products, or the AI technologies that they're trying to incorporate in what they're doing, especially in the med space.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about it. When I'm thinking about AI specifically and machine learning medical devices, and some of the things that we saw and some of the things that we learned as it relates to that, we sat through some of the digital health sessions, right? And this integration of AI and the benefits that exist. Were there things that you kind of picked up on or saw, related to this idea of, these technologies and how AI is really going to improve kind of what we're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's, I guess, a multi-part question, but I mean, you have to look at it from the perspective of the providers, but also the actual end users. And looking from the end user standpoint, it is a big difference when we're applying AI to especially stuff that people already carry. There's not a lot of people who don't carry their phones, and especially these days, smartwatches and all sorts of trackers and wearables. So from that perspective, it gives the end user a lot of that information that we were talking about before. Again, not to say that they didn't have access to it before, but from that perspective, it gives, I guess, a better health outcome for these folks when the information is presented from that perspective in a more coherent, more applicable way, especially with the data being personalized to them a lot of the times. It does add on a lot of the benefits that we wouldn't normally see with the traditional set of data sets that we normally have.
Yeah, you know what? I love to hear you say this because I think that was clearly an overarching theme in a lot of the sessions that we sat through, right? Which is this idea of, okay, how can we build upon what people are already doing, right? It's not just this, oh, we have to drastically ask people to change their way of life or drastically ask people to change the way that they're engaging with their technology or engaging with their devices. It's how do we build upon what people are already doing, right? And you sit in those sessions and they ask, like, okay, how many people are wearing this watch, this ring, right? And you see it, or at a bare minimum, right, carrying around a phone. And it's okay, now how can we take all of that data in a meaningful way, right? Looking at the devices that people already have and integrate it in that, healthcare loop overall. The other thing you mentioned, which I think, we heard a lot about this in the sessions because obviously there's a lot of people who are directly involved in the industry that participate, just this idea of for providers, how AI is going to revolutionize things. And I think, we talked about it on some of our previous podcasts, right? Just this idea of, being able to record in a session and it's transcribed, and then there are, intelligence that it can be used to then come with a certain type of outcome or certain type of recommendation for a doctor, right? Therefore, saving them all of this time that they would have spent reading, researching, transcribing their notes, trying to remember things, right? So this idea of AI being used in a very, very practical sense is also really exciting. And I think, us as consumers, as patients, as people who are going through our day-to-day lives, we're going to see that a lot more in the near future. And then get into some of these very complex ideas surrounding AI with digital twins and AI in your house and predictability of disease and genetic markers, right? And all of these things that are coming, in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And I think from that standpoint too, you mentioned, all of it from a provider standpoint, the data that they have. I think it's good to also point out that there are some obstacles that come along with this kind of stuff. Obviously different providers, different types of data sets. How do you integrate that kind of stuff together that talks to all, ideally one centralized system? There are some foundational issues with AI too that I think, generally speaking, that we have to address. But for sure, I think it is the way everything is going.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about, obviously some of the obstacles that exist when you think about aging populations and the people who are needing healthcare, right? And their overall adoption to this type of new technology or this new way of thinking, a digital health platform, a integration with your doctor in a different type of way, I think there's a lot of, kind of immediate obstacles that exist with this idea of a broad adoption, not only across the industry, right? As people are developing medical devices, as people are developing medical technologies, is AI safe? Can we use AI? What are the bounds of AI? How great is this data? But then also the actual practical adoption of, they talk about it all the time when we sit through these sessions, right? It doesn't matter how great your technology is. If no one's going to use it and it's not going to give any value, then there's no point.
Right. And there's also, I guess the element of economics on both sides, right? You have to make it worth it for the end user, the consumer, to want to get these devices and in a cost-effective way. But also, I guess in some ways, incentivizing the providers to also provide services through these new technologies. And sometimes there's a little bit of, I guess, friction there.
Yeah, I mean, they did talk about too, there are some new codes that have been developed. So for, obviously the payee model, right? For some of these types of digital health technologies, which will make a difference, and things just, kind of overall shows the mindset shift in the industry to truly believe in this type of healthcare and that patients can adequately and accurately, receive treatment in this way, right? So seeing things move in this direction is really positive, I think, not only for the patients who are receiving the care, the providers who are giving the care, but then also the developers and manufacturers of these types of products and devices kind of going into the overall loop that we hope to see with the development process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess from that standpoint too, there's also look at the regulatory side of it also.
Yes, absolutely, of course. Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. Obviously, the area that we think about as it relates to standards and testing and regulatory requirements and, how does AI fit into all of that, right? And what does that look like? So there was definitely some talk about that, of course, when we were sitting through some of these sessions. So were there things that you picked up on or things just from your own experience and background as someone who has worked on lots of different types of products, concerns that you see or things that you see in the regulatory space as AI is starting to flush into these types of devices?
Right. Like most things, there's always going to be something that's cutting edge, something that needs development, especially from the standards and regulatory standpoint. When we look at things, generally speaking, on a day-to-day basis, we think of risks of shock, risk of fire, risk of mechanical hazard. We don't necessarily look at the efficacy of things or how the information is presented or how accurate the information is. So I think from that standpoint, I mean, it is going to be somewhat of a rigorous process to, to figure out what that level of safety we're comfortable with is going to be. But beyond that, too, just from an application standpoint, are we applying it correctly? What are the regulations that are surrounding it, from different markets? What's the FDA doing? What are we doing internationally on the EU side of things? Obviously, everyone recognizes it as something that needs to be looked at. We have the EU AI Act. We have stuff on the FDA side of things. So I think there's a ways to go, but it is going to be important that the regulations exist. Number one, for conformity, we want everything standardized to a certain extent, but we also want to make sure that the data that is presented in a way that people safely using. And I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's so interesting, right? Because you see, as we talked about, right, the FDA has been clearing AI devices for a long time. We've seen a lot of digital health platforms, but more on this predictive side, right? Versus generative AI, where it's like, if you can't tell us how far your algorithm can go, and if you can't tell us how deep it can go, how are we as a regulator supposed to be able to say this is good or this is bad? And I've sat through a lot of really interesting sessions with the FDA on this topic, and their director of digital health really talking about, they need help from the industry, of course, in these instances, right? To see what are people developing, what are the applications, what is the efficacy, what does this mean for patients long term? And I think that's going to be the most exciting part over the next few years, is to see, you have all of these amazing medical companies, providers, doctors, tech companies all kind of coming together saying, hey, we can do these really amazing things with different types of scans, with different types of ways that you can take information back and make, again, early predictions, preventative care, right? So many things that, really are major challenges. And, one of the things that I always find interesting, and we've studied a lot, is just looking at this idea of, okay, as we talked about, patient population getting older, people are getting sicker, right? We know that people are impacted more by chronic diseases. We see that, there's so many more, boomers needing healthcare. At the same time, those are the people who are the physicians, right? Those are the people who are the doctors. So you have a huge number of doctors who are leaving their practices, leaving the field because they're aging out. There's not enough new doctors coming in. So this idea of technology and digital health and all of these digital tools, and especially in the preventative care space, so people need less, right, immediate care, is going to make a huge difference, right? So I think it's a really interesting time to see, how the med device manufacturers are developing these products and what we're seeing in terms of technology that will in turn then benefit, our patient populations as a whole, as we're all trying to get into a doctor, right? It was interesting. I will remember this very specifically from one of the sessions where a gentleman who was, I think he either was a physician or led a group of physicians, and he was like, I tell all of my friends as they're coming out of med school, like, don't become a primary care doctor, right? So we know that as patients, how difficult it is to find a doctor. And even doctors tell each other, like, there's no benefit in being a primary care doctor, right? Go into a specialty. So I think it's really interesting to see, just how technology is gonna take us forward.
Yeah, and even from that perspective, you're right in terms of patients being able to visit doctors, but I think that's what this also sort of helps with, right? It is more continuous care because you have that continuous data, and it's read these stories all the time where a watch says, oh, we detected AFib, and then that's the trigger that then allows that person to then actually follow up and figure out what exactly is going on. And with parsing that data and being able to understand that data and actually relate it to a trigger or something else that leads you then to continue good health and make sure you have those good outcomes, I think is pretty important. And from just extending on what you said before too, considering that there is a gap of knowledge, or there could potentially be a gap of knowledge coming in, I think now is a great time for collaboration, right? Because at the end of the day, these models only output what you put in, and the more information that's given and the more accurate information that's given, the more that's peer reviewed, the better, right? So I think we're pretty much at that point in history, I think, where things are going to start happening.
Right. And it's so much talk about the data, right? So you mentioned it earlier, right? Data across different platforms, right? That's a big challenge that the industry is having, right? Like, no one's operating on universal platforms. So you're getting data from different areas. I think the second part of that too is the patient populations and the subset that you're studying, right? If you have only a certain demographic of data, you can't necessarily translate that to all demographics or all patients that are affected by a certain disease or condition. So there's a lot, I think, in that space that's going to need to be done to be able to aggregate data in a meaningful way that's accurate, as you say, right? Really, how do you make sure that you're not relying on data, especially if you're getting some type of open source data, right? I mean, there's a lot of concern there versus, how it can be made and used in the most effective way, right? It's a really complex issue, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So lots of discussions about data. It's interesting to hear, I think, too, everyone's different perspective as well. Again, when you sit down in these types of sessions and you have the doctors, you have people representing the healthcare system, you have people representing the industry, you have people representing the regulators, right? What my favorite thing about these types of events and these types of discussions is always seeing everybody coming together. I think sometimes the healthcare industry gets a little bit of a bad rap as being a money-driven business, where you really do see they're trying to come together the best that they can to say, we have this knowledge of technology, we have all of this expertise in terms of treating and diagnosing diseases, we know how to put patients through the system, and bringing that all together to say, okay, how do we take what everybody is doing in a meaningful way and then translate that back to the industry so we know the types of products and devices that are needed, where the biggest use cases are, things like that. Yeah.
I think from that point, I guess, how do you think about when we converge your healthcare devices to the home? We're used to seeing, I guess, the old wellness devices, right? Your sleep monitors, your heart rate monitors. How does that look like, I guess, from the transition of that being a true home healthcare device for specific, monitoring, for specific, patient-related stuff?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, right? Because we have seen these devices for a long time, just consumer-driven devices, right? Data, you're just collecting data, it's a data point, right? And now they're taking that a step further where it actually is then being used, the information's going to your doctor. And again, with what we were talking about earlier, right? The biggest concerns with that when these products are being developed are people going to use them, right? How are you making sure that people are using them for the right prescribed amount of time, that they're using it in the correct way, right? So that the data that the doctor or the physician is getting back actually is accurate and representative of, what someone is going and doing in their day-to-day life. But I think what's super interesting and what we saw and heard a lot about, not only in the sessions, but just also walking around CES and seeing the different types of technology and devices, is just this kind of like integrated ecosystem idea, right? Where healthcare is becoming part of your everyday life. And the idea of, not just preventative care, but wellness, right? And really translating wellness into actual medical care. So not just this, eat healthy and walk, but like actually taking it. It was really interesting. There was a gentleman who was talking in one of the panels, and he was talking about kind of the 4 main pillars of health, your diet, your exercise. And one of the big ones, I think number 4, was sleep. And talking about that, I thought was so interesting, because you have all of these devices, right, for sleep apnea, measuring people's sleep, CPAP machines, right, because it's such a big indicator of your overall health. And he was said, change your diet if you want to, change your exercise habits if you want to, change your stress level if you want to, but if you don't change your sleep, like, you're never going to be a healthy person. And it was so interesting, right, because you see, hey, if you're wearing a certain type of watch or a ring, or you're wearing a monitoring device, like, you can actually make dramatic impacts in your health. And so that's always like one of the best parts about being at these kind of conferences and listening to the discussions of, things that you can translate into your real life and say, okay, yes, when we see all of these types of products and devices coming out, they really do make a long-term impact in someone's health. And if you correct a sleep disorder, if you're correcting, something that someone is doing while they're inactive, right? Think about how that translates then into their overall well-being and their overall state of care, right? And then again, just goes back into that cycle of less of a drain on the healthcare system, right? It's just a really fascinating kind of to start at the core when people are living their day-to-day lives. It's not just seeing your doctor 30 minutes once a year, once every 2 years. Now it's, you can have a healthcare plan and be working with a physician all the time.
Yeah, and to that point too, a lot of the times when people, actually end up going to a physician, it's usually for something very specific. It's something they felt or something that they recently are having to deal with. But with this kind of stuff, I mean, especially when we talk about an ecosystem of products and all these manufacturers who are building, healthcare into multiple devices, it does really give you that holistic view of how you live, or it can at least, assuming you have these devices to kind of talk to each other. So that's one of those opportunities you never really got before, right? Multiple streams of information all getting collected into one location, and then parsing information and actual information in terms of action items, et cetera, and presenting that to someone. That kind of stuff did not exist before, at least not in the way we're seeing it now. So I think it's pretty
And I think too, what's super interesting, right? And we see this a lot in the devices that are coming to us that we're testing, right? And this idea of home use devices and wearable devices, it takes a very specific subset of testing and a test plan, right? Because now you're introducing something into someone's day-to-day life. And so it's not as cut and dry as it was before. You see, as you say, right, influence of technology, healthcare, right, coming together. So it's how do you put together a test plan that not only looks at the safety as you're talking about, but the performance of a product, right? If someone's using it, different sizes of patients, different activity levels of patients, right? How they're using it, where they're using it. So much then comes into play on the testing side of it, right? As you're looking at these home care products or these wearable devices that maybe previously weren't looked at as medical devices, but now we see it is a really big opportunity in this space for manufacturers to actually treat these as medical products and devices that then can really have a long-term impact in someone's, state of care.
Yeah, no, for sure. And if CES was any indication, it looks like there's a lot more manufacturers coming out, and we're all for that. So
yes, absolutely. I know it was a really great show this year. Love that there's always a focus on healthcare, a focus on digital health. I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. The robot space, right? Everything that we're seeing, the incredible developments that people are coming out with. It's just always fascinating to have so many people together at the same time, highlighting their technologies and highlighting their, new ideas and what they're working on. So really interesting discussion today, Zaneer. So glad you were able to join me. Is there any other takeaways or tidbits or things you wanted to share from your time at CES or your thoughts on the digital health or AI space in general?
No, I mean, I think we pretty much covered it all. I just need to know when I can buy that robot that I saw. That's all.
Exactly, right? Clean up all your stuff at home, right? Yeah, personal care right there. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, if anyone has questions or would like to talk about these topics further, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you so much for joining.
All right, thanks.